Hi everyone, I'm Mark Wasilio. I'm the MLA for Fort Garry, and welcome to our 9th episode on the Ledge podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to all things provincial politics. Summer is over and we're back, and there's a lot to talk about that's happened over the summer months. This week on the pod, we have an update on the Point Douglas Residents Association's battle to protect their neighborhood from Wab Kinew imposing a safe consumption site against their will. There's a happy ending to the story. Likewise, we have an update on the Sio Silica mine project and the community fighting back against the Kinew government. Then we talk about media, freedom of the press, and some very Trump-like behavior from the Kinew government. And if you like democratic accountability, we talk about a very troubling partnership between the Kinew government and the Winnipeg Free Press. Finally, we'll dive into the many scandals of Family Minister Nahanni, Fontaine, and the Kinew government reluctance to show any sort of leadership when it comes to this hapless minister. And we want to talk about what that says to Manitobans about this government. Finally, we have a clip of my Clay Young interview with Global News. So we have lots to cover. Let's get into it. Well, first up on the pod today, I want to talk about Point Douglas consumption site and give listeners an update. As listeners may recall, in our last episode of the pod, we interviewed community members from Point Douglas who met with Premier Kinew to express their concerns with locating a safe consumption site in their community. And as you recall, that meeting did not go well. They found Wab Kinew was disrespectful, dismissive, and demeaning to them. He told the Point Douglas Residents Association members that they, and I quote, didn't represent the community and wouldn't listen to what they had to say, and he ended the meeting abruptly and walked out. This was a shocking meeting and a shocking look at the real character of the Premier and how he behaves when the cameras are off. But 6 days after we posted that interview, things changed in a big way. The Premier announced that he was now backing down and no longer considering the Point Douglas site for safe consumption. This after the minister and local MLA promised the site would be up and running by the end of this year. That promise was made in July, and they're now promising a new site before the next election in 2027, another potentially 2 years from now. So Wab Kinew continued to gaslight Manitobans and said that, and I quote, "We did a good faith consultation with the community. There's clearly a desire to look at other locations," end quote. Of course, none of that is true. One of the complaints by the Point Douglas Residents Association was that there wasn't good faith consultation. The Kinew government manipulated and was very secretive and wouldn't hold open town halls where all community members would attend. In fact, the community held their own town halls and conducted their own consultation when it was clear that their government would not do so. So basically, government consultation amounted to talking at this community, not actually listening to their concerns and not addressing them. So despite the rhetoric, this was a clear political loss for Kinew. He faced a backlash, and the community organized, and it led to him backing down. It was a huge win for the community of Point Douglas. They should all be very proud. But keep in mind, the government had been planning this for 2 years. 2 years that they failed to have meaningful consultation with the community, and it blew up in their face as a result. Now they have less than 2 years to get another site open, and hopefully they've learned the lesson and will actually do meaningful consultations. But keep in mind, and this is the underlying issue here, is that every year Kinew waits to open up a safe consumption site, another 500 Manitobans will die from preventable overdose. So the stakes are very high here. And for this to work, people have to trust the Kinew government. And this debacle has shown that the province has acted with anything but trust. They've gaslight, they've selectively consulted, they've engaged in issues management. They've gone so far to even bar the media from public meetings. None of that invokes trust. And of course, the worry now is the Kinew government's going to pick a new community that isn't as well organized and motivated like Point Douglas is. And basically, an unorganized community will be prey for Wab to impose his will and basically create a sacrifice zone in that community where they can put some of Manitobans' largest and most problematic issues into their neighborhood without any sort of meaningful consultation or having the supports in place to address some of the negative aspects of the policy that are absolutely going to come about. But in the end, this is a good news story. This was a David versus Goliath story, and David won. And the people of Point Douglas wouldn't be bullied by the Premier, and they stood tall and forced him to back down in a very humiliating way. So this is very much a win for local democracy. So I want to give our listeners an update on the Sio Silica story because there's been some major developments over the summer months. And I want to begin with a brief recap. So a Calgary-based mining company wants to drill into a water aquifer that provides safe drinking water for southeastern Manitoba, over 70,000 people. This is their primary source of drinking water. They want to basically send vacuum tubes down into the aquifer and to scoop up pure silica sand for export. Originally, they claimed that they needed this sand for oil fracking. That didn't prove particularly popular with Manitobans, so this Calgary company is now saying that they want to use this silica sand to make solar panels, which is obviously has a lot more public backing. Problem is that there's no companies out there that actually want to build solar panels in Manitoba. They found a German company that wrote a sort of memorandum of interest, but they haven't spent 1 cent or $1 in Manitoba, and they haven't done anything to actually start the planning process to open up a solar panel factory in Manitoba. So it's curious about what exactly they're going to do with this sand and whether it actually is going to create any meaningful jobs in Manitoba. Today, we can't say that it will. Now, that being said, this company recruited to their board of directors some heavy hitters from the PC party, including some of their top donors. And this was when the PCs were still in power. And the community was rightly concerned that they were asking to employ a very new method of mining, and that there is scientific opinion that the process will damage the aquifer, polluting the source of safe drinking water for one of the fastest growing regions of Manitoba. So there's been huge pushback from the community. Now, I was the environment critic for the NDP in opposition, and we took the position that people's drinking water was off limits, the precautionary principle of environmental stewardship. If there's a risk to the community, it's not one worth taking. Subsequently, there was a further scandal that occurred that after the PCs lost government and in the transition period before the Kinew government took power, former PC ministers were trying to get the project approved, even though they had no moral authority to do so because they had just lost the election. The former premier and 2 other ministers from that government were fined by the ethics commissioner and found guilty of violating Manitoba law. But that's not the whole story. I can tell you that the Manitoba NDP caucus was pretty universally opposed to this project, but not Wab Kinew. He's never said anything in public that he was opposed to the project or that he would protect Manitoba's safe drinking water sources for southeastern Manitoba. And in fact, I had a telling moment where I witnessed, when I was the environment critic, with the former NDP minister who got to meet directly with Wab Kinew and myself about Sio Silica. And this was when we were still in opposition. And this former NDP minister was advocating strongly for Wab Kinew to come out publicly and disavow this project and say that he was going to stand up for the clean drinking rights of southeastern Manitoba. And he wouldn't do it. In fact, the meeting got really tense. Kinew was demeaning and disrespectful to this long-term party activist and former cabinet minister. He would not even acknowledge the concerns that this former cabinet minister was raising and was deflecting the whole meeting. You could see the tension build in the room. The former NDP cabinet minister was getting agitated. At one point, he'd even threatened to not vote for Kinew's NDP in the upcoming election. So now after the election, after Kinew won, the then environment minister had the decision to make as to whether or not she would approve this project. And she had complained to me personally that she was getting huge pushback from party members and the community not to approve the project. But she was also getting huge pressure from the Premier's office, and told me that a number of sort of Premier's closest allies in cabinet were being sent to her to apply direct pressure on her to approve the project. She stood her ground, to her credit. And what saved the day was that there was a second silica mine project being proposed near Hollow Water, and a compromise was approved that the Hollow Water project would be approved and the Sio Silica one would be shelved. So this way the Premier could save face and show that he was a supporter of mining, while at the same time skip this sort of very controversial project. But after this incident, you saw a definite shift in tone and rhetoric. Kinew began to frame this project as an indigenous economic reconciliation project. In fact, the company started reframing their approach as well. So the nearest First Nation to this project was Broken Head Ojibwe Nation. And although the drilling wouldn't affect their source of clean drinking water and wouldn't actually occur on their traditional lands, they were sort of the First Nation that was identified by Sio Silica, and who Sio Silica made huge efforts to build relationships with. Sio Silica also began running ads. They hired lobbyists to lobby MLAs directly at the legislature. They began sponsoring Blue Bomber games, and they started becoming a major sponsor of Broken Head Ojibwe First Nation, providing a lot of advertising revenue to the First Nation when they're putting on community events. And so they basically were doing a full court press. And they proposed partnering with Broken Head First Nation and promised to give them $5 million a year in fees if they would sort of partner with Sio Silica. And the First Nation actually consulted with their members. They put this partnership to a vote. And on August 8th of this year, the Broken Head First Nation members overwhelmingly voted against partnering with Sio Silica. Despite their community not being directly impacted by the potential negative environmental effects of the project, and that money would have gone a long way to help that community, they stood with their neighbors and said, no, that Manitoba clean drinking water was not a commodity. It was not something to be sacrificed for a distant corporate profits. And it also put a wrench in Kinew's rebranding strategy. So he can now not claim that greenlighting the Sio Silica project is part of some type of indigenous economic reconciliation. The community was consulted, and they didn't want this type of development. So this is a huge win for the environment. It's a huge win for Manitobans. But what the underlying story here is it actually brought Manitobans together, and it's an incredibly inspiring story where neighbors are looking out for neighbors, and we're saying in Manitoba that just some things aren't worth making money off of and putting our clean water at risk. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about press freedom in Manitoba. And of course, a free and independent press is needed to keep politicians accountable. We're seeing the disappearance of reporters, and people are no longer following the news from traditional media outlets. Non-traditional blogs are often just opinionated-based websites that don't have rigorous fact-checking and can be rife with misinformation. So as Canadians, we're often a little smug looking at the U.S. and say that what's happening down there can't happen here. But, we see how Trump threatens the press and treats them. He dismisses them. Their questions, he barks out that it's fake news, especially if they're tough questions and questions that are critical of decisions his government's made and are trying to hold him accountable. Now, we look at that horror down south and say, thank goodness it can't happen here. But there's been a couple of incidents involving Wab Kinew, which are very much Trump-like responses to the media. If you recall, there was a big blow-up about Pierre Poilievre punching down and being very demeaning and dismissive to a BC local reporter. He was eating an apple, was super arrogant and smug with the reporter asking him serious questions, and he was being argumentative with him and dismissive. So people were outraged by that. But that same type of behavior is now happening in Manitoba. We've had a couple of those same moments recently with our very mercurial premier, the first of which occurred at the end of May of this year. As you recall, there was a massive wildfire from Lynn Lake, and it was encroaching on Flin Flon, and there was going to be a discussion about evacuating the town of Flin Flon to get out of the way of the wildfires. So a press conference is called to announce the evacuation, and the premier was asked a question. One of the residents was saying that the fire had started at a mine site from Alamo Mines. And the premier responded to this question, and I quote, "What proof do you have that Alamo is connected to the mine site?" Now, the context of this is the Kinew government has not been great on economic development or the creation of new jobs. In fact, we've been losing jobs in Manitoba under Wab Kinew. On March 25th, 2 months prior to this incident, the government had a huge press conference and made a big deal about Alamo Gold Mine opening up and starting in Manitoba. Now, keep in mind, these mines take 7 to 10 years from planning to actually opening up, so no government can really claim any sort of credit for getting these mines started, but they're going to try anyways. So he needed to show that Manitoba was open for business and that he was pro-mining premier and doing something or anything to bring in good jobs in Manitoba because his economic record has been incredibly thin. So he pounces on any suggestion of wrongdoing by Alamo Mine, and he lectures the female reporter on responsible reporting and tells her not to report on hearsay, and then instructs her during this press conference what she should be asking him questions on, which is what he wanted to answer questions on, and what she should be reporting on that day, which is what he wanted her to report on that day, which was the purpose of the press conference, which was his message. And he talked about, let's focus on the message of that day, is that Flin Flon is a large community on the verge of evacuation. And he's asking people to hear that message and to get ready for evacuation. And he's irritated that she's not playing along and that she's asking accountability questions. And by bullying this reporter, he basically closed off this line of questioning and he didn't have to answer it. And he's basically telling her what to write and what a spin to put on for her report. Now, that's all pretty gross and very Trumpian sort of media management. But what makes this story really troubling is what happens next. The province's own independent investigation unit began looking into the causes of the Lynn Lake fire. So they investigated the fire, and they applied for a search warrant for the Alamos gold mine. That fire caused $10 million worth of damage. It destroyed homes. It caused thousands of people to become displaced and become climate refugees. And the allegations that were in the search warrant is that Alamos Gold violated the province's Wildfire Act by starting a fire without taking sufficient precautions to ensure that they could keep it under control. Now, to be clear, these have not been proven in court. They're just allegations in a search warrant. But the key point here is that there's literally, where there's smoke, there's fire. The reporter had a legitimate question, and it was incumbent on the premier to answer it, and he didn't. He bullied this reporter to avoid answering that question, and this investigation is still ongoing, and there will be more to talk about later. Now, Kinew hasn't taken responsibility or reached out to that reporter to apologize for his behavior. I doubt he even understands what he did was so wrong. But just a short few weeks later, he does it again. This time, it happens during the by-election for Spruce Woods this July. Kinew was doing a press conference for the by-election, and again, there's a pattern to this behavior. When the premier is being criticized, whether it's by the residents of North Point Douglas about not being consulted about safe consumption side of their neighborhood, or reporters are asking tough questions about the premier's newest mine, suspected of starting a fire that caused millions of dollars of damage and disrupted thousands of lives, he gets defensive. And when he gets defensive, he becomes, in the words of Winnipeg Sun publisher and former PC cabinet minister Kevin Klein, condescending, arrogant, and dismissive. Now, on this occasion, a Brandon Sun reporter asked the premier why he waited so long to call the by-election in Spruce Woods. And again, just for a little background, there had been 2 prior by-elections, one in Safe NDPC Transcona and Target NDPC Tuxedo, where the premier, within a couple of weeks, basically 30, 40 days after the vacancy, had called the by-election. And he waited almost to the very end. There's a 6-month deadline where you are forced to call a deadline to call a by-election in Spruce Woods, which is not typically an NDP seat, which would be harder for the NDP to win, and of course didn't win. So the concern from the reporter was that the premier was playing politics, that he was not filling a seat that he didn't have a great chance of winning, and denying the people of Spruce Woods a representative for almost half a year because they wouldn't be the right kind of MLA. So he starts off in a very flippant manner, responding to the reporter's question by saying, "What's the rush?" Then he challenges the reporter by saying, "Well, I'm your premier. What would you like me to do? Call a by-election? Why?" This is vintage Pierre Poilievre stuff. And he attacks and accuses the reporter of bias. And I quote here, "Oh, it seems like you're taking a very hard line opinion in terms of this news article you're going to be writing. Are you going to declare that?" And basically what the premier is saying is that the reporter's question isn't legitimate, that the reporter has an opinion and he should declare his bias and his opinion. And he never ends up answering the question, and he's punching down on this reporter. So he's sending the message, if you ask tough questions, you'll be accused of this premier of being biased, or in Trump language, fake news. Again, this is bullying behavior. But it didn't stop there. In the run-up to the by-election, Kinew pledged over $300 million in new spending on Spruce Woods area, an area that he's pretty much ignored until this by-election. And he's asked about the sudden deluge in announcements for the area, and he states, "I'm surprised it's not more." And then he attacks the reporter, and I quote, "You seem to be really on this really narrow thing. Expand your mind." And of course, this was a legitimate question. Why is there this huge, massive influx of funding for an area that didn't have it before a by-election? And the premier didn't want to answer. He demeaned and denigrated the reporter, who was just doing their job. And of course, he didn't answer. And again, what message is that sending to the press? This is bullying. Kinew knows that these are legitimate questions. It's strange he wasn't prepared for them. It had been in the news already. He had to have seen it coming. His staff would have known it was coming, and his staff would have known that they would have been asked these sorts of questions. But instead of answering them, he chose to demean, deflect, and bully the reporters. The only thing that was missing is Wab Kinew screaming out fake news. And what he did was very much sort of the same style of Trump reporting of these type of controversies and deflection. So if that was the end of it, it would be troubling and concerning, but it keeps on again. About a week ago, the premier showed up at a press conference about paving a roadway just on the outskirts of northwestern Winnipeg towards the Sikh Society of Manitoba. And he was asked by a Free Press reporter some tough questions about various controversies and issues happening in Manitoba. And according to Dan Lett, Winnipeg Free Press columnist, he again was combative and prickly with this reporter. And Dan Lett sort of dismissed it as arrogance based on the fact that he's riding high in the polls. But that can't possibly be true because this has been his pattern all along. And when you look at how he's treated the people of Point Douglas, when reporters are asking him tough questions, this is the standard sort of petty, mean-spirited response that you get from the premier. And all that is concerning when you think about democracy and accountability and the public's right to know. We've also seen a disturbing trend with the Kinew government, and it also kind of reveals where the real power lies. And it's not with the cabinet ministers. We're seeing that, what's normal in a parliamentary system like ours is cabinet ministers have the power to deal with issues that fall under their portfolio. It also means that they have the responsibility when something goes wrong. And they're the ones that the press turns to get some type of statement and answer tough questions when things aren't going well in their portfolio. But that's not how things work in the Kinew government. The ministers have no power or agency, and their role is just to do grunt work for the premier, who basically sets all the directions for them. They're more figureheads than real power brokers, and that's a problem. When you have one man, the premier in this case, making all the decisions, things are going to get missed. Not everything is a priority. Government tends to spend all its time in damage control mode as opposed to actually getting ahead of problems and fixing them before they become a mess. And we're seeing that with healthcare. Under Kinew, things have gotten much, much worse. Minor problems have been ignored, and then they turn into major crises. An example is safety and security of staff and patients at the health sciences campus. More recently, there's another example. The province dismantled the Protection for Persons in Care office. Now, that office used to investigate and protect seniors from elder abuse, and there was an audit done. It was found to be tragically incompetent, and the government was looking to create some type of new independent office. Now, 2 years in office, there's been no progress about creating an independent investigation unit. And why all this matters and relates to the press is that the Premier's principal secretary, and that's basically really his press officer, has been the one giving the government position and answers when tough questions have been occurring and things have been unraveling both in the health department and in the Protection for Persons in Care office. There's a couple of reasons for this, why you should be concerned. These unelected staffers in the Premier's office have no real accountability. The minister isn't answering the questions, they're not being held to account. And there's nobody that you can point to and say, they're not doing their job. It also reveals that the real power in the Kinew cabinet is very much in the Premier's office. So why go talk to a minister when they really don't have any say? Why not talk to the principal secretary who apparently answers the tough questions? And it's also clear that the Premier has lost some faith in the health minister to answer these questions when things go wrong, and that the Kinew government wants their own press secretary answering these questions so they can control the message where they obviously don't think that they can control the message coming from their senior ministers. It's a clear lack of faith. Now, it also sends the signal that the minister is not accountable here and that these decisions are, more importantly, made by the Premier. None of this is good for democracy, and it's clearly shown that it's not good for proper functioning of our government. Now, before I leave this topic, there has been a development with the Winnipeg Free Press and the Kinew government that needs to be talked about. It's something that I think is gotten very little attention in Manitoba, and Manitobans should be very concerned. Media outlets are struggling, especially local media. In my 6 years at the Ledge, I've seen less and less journalists cover what's going on. And I've been told my colleagues who've been around for 25 years that compared to what it was 25 years ago, there's shocking little media that covers provincial politics now than they did a generation ago. To that end, the Kinew government at the end of May of this year announced a partnership with the Winnipeg Free Press. You heard that right. The government of Manitoba is partnering with a for-profit media outlet whose role is to hold the government to account. Now, the Kinew government brought in its Department of Education together with the largest school division in Manitoba, the Winnipeg School Division, that has over 33,000 students, to launch a media literacy platform. And they want to give lessons on journalism, social media algorithms, and media literacy to our students. Who can be upset about that? So far, so good. Now, here's the problem. The Winnipeg Free Press, for-profit media company with its very own bias, is helping to design the curriculum to be taught to public school kids. So taxpayer dollars are funding the teachers who will be part of this initiative and will create its content. The Winnipeg Free Press is hosting the curriculum on their website. Now, this is a paywall subscription-based website. So you need to subscribe to the Winnipeg Free Press to access this resource. Winnipeg Free Press will make money off of this initiative, money off a taxpayer-funded curriculum, which teachers will be forced to get their families to access. It's a captured audience. It's also cross-marketing. Parents and students will be directed to the Winnipeg Free Press, be required to read their stories and to access their platform as part of a public school program. So the Winnipeg Free Press gets new customers, it uses the public education system to market their products, and it uses taxpayer money to enhance their income. Now, the idea behind this is that teachers will be assigning students to read articles and content from Winnipeg Free Press journalists and videos off the site. This is wrong in so many ways. A private, for-profit corporation having input into the curriculum of Manitoba students, it's more creeping privatization. We're seeing it in healthcare, government services, and now education with the Kinew government. And secondly, and most importantly, it's a conflict of interest between the Free Press holding the government accountable with the Kinew government helping enrich the Winnipeg Free Press. So the perception of bias here is that the Kinew government will get flattering or less critical coverage of its government for the Winnipeg Free Press, fearing losing this deal. And what does this say about the integrity and credibility of the paper that they would engage in this type of an arrangement? So this is a huge step backwards for local media in Manitoba. It gives people even less reasons to trust the news. So now we have to talk about Nahanni Fontaine, Manitoba's embattled families minister, and a number of controversies over the summer. Now, it started during grad season. There was a gala on June 26 to celebrate Indigenous women's graduates. Next to the minister on stage was an American Sign Language interpreter. After Fontaine concluded her initial remarks, she stepped in front of an APTN camera crew for an interview. Before the interview had begun, Fontaine was talking to a staffer, complaining about the ASL interpreter being on stage next to her and that she had to leave, meaning the interpreter. Fontaine found the signing to be distracting, and the ASL interpreter was actually removed from the stage and had to do the rest of her signing from below the stage. Now, her comments were demeaning, and it showed a certain sort of attitude where she had to be the center of attention. That erupted in controversy because what had happened at this time is, despite the fact that the interview hadn't started with APTN, the cameras were rolling, and all this was captured on film. People were outraged. People began to call for her resignation. Keep in mind, this is the minister responsible for advocating for the disabilities community here in Manitoba. Now, it was later reported that members of the deaf community in the audience were hurt by her actions and comments, and mid-event, because the interpreter was off stage, they couldn't actually see the interpretation of the event and therefore didn't know what was going on and couldn't participate fully in their own grad ceremony, if you can believe that. To compound matters, shortly afterwards, APTN staff noticed that they were all blocked from accessing Fontaine's social media channels, and that came out in public. And again, more embarrassment, and the move got reversed. And initially, Fontaine blamed it on her office, and when asked who blocked the journalist, Fontaine refused to say. And then she came and claimed to take full responsibility for her office, never taking personal responsibility for herself, or explained who exactly blocked those journalists. So Fontaine, unscripted, acting when she thought nobody was watching, you got a real sense of this minister's character. And many called for her resignation. Now, Kinew refused to discipline her and kept her in the role. She actually faced no consequence at all. Keep in mind, as family minister, her job is to advocate for the disabilities community. So how confident would the disabilities community be with this minister advocating her when she's shown what her attitude has been to that community? Why would you continue to have faith and trust in her? A minister more concerned about her being the center of attention than serving the actual people in the audience, which were being celebrated. Now, that wasn't the end of the controversial comments from Minister Fontaine. She is responsible for the Child Family Services aspect of Manitoba government. She met with Foster Parents Association of Manitoba president. And the words of Jamie Faux, P-F-A-U, I apologize if I didn't pronounce that right, she was dismissed as a colonizer and a white savior. I was told that I have no place in helping or advocating, that I have no place in the foster care world except to be a foster parent and to kind of know my place. Now, Fontaine denied making those remarks. Problem is, Fontaine has made those kind of remarks numerous times. I've heard them myself personally. I've received complaints from people in the community who had met with Minister Fontaine, who demeaned them in those conversations and called them white colonizers, and then told them that they had no right to have an opinion about CFS system, even though they were taxpayers, and obviously all Manitobans have the right to have an opinion about the CFS system in Manitoba. She's also made similar comments in caucus in front of Wab Kinew. And to no one's surprise, I know he's received complaints about her using this type of race-baiting language in the community from other MLAs and from the public generally. Now, after the story came out about Fontaine's social media blocking APTN reporters, the foster parents felt that they too were being blocked by the minister's office. the Foster Parents Association emails were not being responded to. So when you send a letter to a government minister, you're going to get an immediate response back saying that they've received your letter. Well, the foster parents were not getting that response back letter. So to test their theory that they were being blocked, the president of the Foster Parents Association used a non-Foster Parent Association account to email the minister. And it went through, and they got an immediate notification of receipt email. So Global News tried to get an answer from Fontaine's office about this. They contacted them July 29th, again on July 31st, and then they attempted to contact the Premier's office and no response. So they air the story on August 4th about this, and Fontaine's office responds for the first time on August 5th, only after it hits the news. Now, that behavior was concerning. And again, Kinew took no action. So around the same time, June 29, 2025, the Winnipeg Sun reported a leaked Instagram message from Fontaine and one of her constituents. This constituent was a young veteran, a member of the indigenous community. The constituent was critical of Fontaine and challenged her on some of her decisions, and it appears that she engaged in a social media debate, and it got very personal very fast. She referred to him in demeaning, disrespectful language as, and I quote, a little guy, and for him to take a nap, and told him that women owe nothing to men. And I quote here, "You need a nap, little guy, and in case you don't know, women don't owe you or men anything. LOL, imagine thinking you, a perfect stranger, a little guy, thinking you can demand anything from me. Go take that nap now. Sleep well." End quote. This is a minister and an MLA responding to a constituent. And I hate to break it to Minister Fontaine, you're a public servant. That constituent very much can demand answers from you as an MLA and especially as Minister of the Crown. So look how this minister is treating Manitobans. Now, they may disagree, and I'm sure he was rude, and part of the job of being an MLA or a Minister of the Crown is to be professional and not to engage in petty, vindictive, personal style attacks. So even if, and it's tough, constituents are not always pleasant or nice, as MLAs, we have to rise above that. We have to tamp down the temperature to have a respectful conversation and answer people's questions and not demean and belittle them just because they have the nerve to ask you tough questions and be critical of your decision. It certainly sends a wrong signal, and that's not the behavior that Manitobans expect of their MLAs. I don't believe Kinew has been asked about this. And again, this is a pattern of behavior. You can go into Hansard and pull out example after example of Fontaine being disrespectful, demeaning, and belittling in the House. Now, in fairness, in the House, all MLAs at one time or another, including myself, have done that. And I don't want to be too critical about that. But you can't say that this was out of character. And you can say this, and as a former attack dog for the NDP, there are still rules. And even when you're in the heat of sort of partisan battle, you don't get personal and you absolutely don't disrespect constituents and Manitobans. So you may be sharper with an opposing MLA. They give as good as they take, but that doesn't apply to the people you represent. So that leads us now to Charlie Kirk. For those who don't know, Charlie Kirk is a Trump-associated conservative political activist who had a huge following in the U.S. and has organized young conservatives to rally around the Trump agenda. In short, he was very influential and had a massive reach. Now, his politics are troubling. His views have been characterized as hate-filled, racist, homophobic. In short, this is a very controversial figure. And when he was assassinated, Fontaine took to social media and retweeted a tweet from an American activist who extended, and I quote, "no empathy for the killing of Charlie Kirk." This immediately blew up into the media as a firestorm. It became not only a national news, it became international news. It was an embarrassment for a government minister to be seen to what people were interpreting was a callous condoning of the political murder of a father and a husband who was killed because somebody didn't like their views. I don't like Charlie Kirk's views. I spent my time in politics actively fighting against them. But I always defend the right for Manitobans to make those arguments, even if I disagree. And I'll always condemn any political violence and the attempt to literally silence someone who you disagree with. It's abhorrent and has no place in our democracy. Kinew was on an unrelated radio program when Fontaine's post was read to him. He reacted appropriately and said that he would speak to her. He was horrified by those comments. And according to Kinew, after he spoke to her, there was a press officer who then issued an apology purported to be coming from Minister Fontaine. Now, she has yet to show the courage of actually standing in front of a media scrum to explain herself. And again, the calls for her resignation have come far and wide. There's numerous letters to the editors of both papers calling for her to resign. There was an impromptu demonstration in front of the Ledge calling for her resignation. MLAs in the Premier's office have received numerous letters calling on her to resign. Yet Kinew has stood by her and didn't seek her resignation. So someone who has repeatedly embarrassed the government has become a distraction where the media story he wanted to get out that day didn't, because all the press was concerned was about her views on Charlie Kirk. Yet Kinew seems paralyzed to act. This is not the first offense. It wasn't even a second offense. This is a pattern of behavior of a government minister that lacks professionalism, good judgment, and maturity to do the job. If you are a foster parent or a member of the disability community or a right-leaning voter, do you have any faith that Minister Fontaine will act with your interests in mind? Because that's the job. She has to act for everyone, even white saviors and colonizers, and it made it clear that she doesn't want to do that. And that seems to be okay with Kinew. That's the message he sends by keeping her in cabinet, or even in caucus for that matter, that Fontaine has a favorite quote in the Ledge. She said it millions and millions of times. I've heard it ad nauseum. She says, "When people show you who they are, believe them." The irony is just too much here. Jokes certainly write themselves.
The following interview with Clay Young is from GlobalTV and aired in August. In the interview, Mr. Young refers to a vacant seat, which at the time was in the Spruce Woods constituency. This seat has since been filled by the PCs in a by-election.
All right, we're going to talk a little politics now. There are, as you probably are aware, there are 57 seats in the Manitoba Legislature. Governing NDP hold 34 seats. The PC's 20, there is one Liberal, one Independent, and one seat is currently vacant. Now, the lone Independent the seat is currently held by Mark Vassiliou, who represents Fort Garry, and he joins us now. Good to finally meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
So maybe give us some background for people not aware of your situation. You held the seat for the NDP in 2019.
That's right, and I was reelected in 2023.
Right, and in 2024, last year, the party kicked you out. Can you summarize what happened?
Well, essentially, I was having conflict with Wab Kinew. I'm not a yes man. I'm somebody that stands up for what I think is right and for what I think my voters voted me for. So I would challenge him on various issues, and I think he found that very threatening. And he orchestrated my removal, and I was kicked out in September of 2024.
What is your relationship with the Premier now? Do you speak at all?
No, it's tense. In fact, I was in a committee meeting with him several months ago where I was directly asking questions, and he was mean-spirited, aggressive, abusive towards me. So I think the Premier is he's not going to be sending me any flowers anytime soon.
Do you think it's basically because, as you say, you're not a yes man?
No.
You weren't agreeing with everything that was being discussed around the table.
Well, things weren't getting discussed around the table. That was part of the problem. The NDP prides itself on being a democratic party. It prides itself on consensus decision-making. Wab Kinew is very authoritarian, top-down leader, doesn't really sort of have the culture of the New Democratic Party. So he would come into a meeting and basically say, this is what we're going to do, and there was no discussion. And oftentimes what he was proposing, I knew that the table didn't agree with him, and somebody had to say something, and that often was me.
So what is the reaction of the people in Fort Garry since you become an independent? They may have voted NDP and not necessarily for you, the man.
I was the school trustee for that area for the north part of the riding for about 8 years prior. So I do have a lot of relationships with my constituents, but that was actually a pleasant surprise. I got overwhelming support, calls, emails, texts, people dropping by. I think, Manitobans are fair-minded, and when they saw how I was treated and what had happened to me, they sensed that it was wrong. And so it was very supportive.
And as an independent, you find yourself busy?
Very much so. You become hyper-focused on your constituency. There's a lot of challenges we have in Fort Garry, and I'm sort of freed from the other sort of party obligations that I'd have to do before, and I can just concentrate on my constituents, which is refreshing.
Right, and you're also a lawyer.
I am, yeah.
And you don't have a conflict of, you can do, as far as you're concerned, you can be the lawyer and you can be the MLA, no problem, no conflict either way?
No, I mean, there's lots of MLAs who have other sort of work and interests. Being an MLA is not a 9-to-5 job. Most of the work happens on evenings and weekends, and we only sit about 60 days of the year. So, I'm taking a fraction of the cases that I used to, but I still have sort of a foot in it. But I am, and I see myself as an MLA first, and I prioritize the needs of my constituents first. They always come first, and I can make it work.
So moving forward, there's going to be another provincial election down the road. Will you run again? Will you run again as an independent?
2 years is a long time in politics, and so I haven't made any decisions yet. And I certainly, I've been in politics as an elected official 14 years now, so I'll have to have those discussions with my family and what the future brings.
Has any other political party reached out for you to join them?
Absolutely. All three of them, the PCs, and Greens, and the Liberals have.
Would you ever join the PCs?
No, I now sit with them on the opposition benches, and I tell you, that's been really eye-opening for me because I'm out of the hyper-partisan politics now, and I've developed some good friendships, and there's some very good people in the PC benches, but I just don't see the world the way they do. So I like a lot of them, but I wouldn't join their team.
What about the Liberals?
The Liberal Party has made overtures to me, and they've even gone so far as invited me to run for their leadership. And I certainly have more in common with the Liberal Party in Manitoba, but I haven't made any decisions yet.
But you could, if you threw your hat in the ring, you could possibly be the new leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party. I mean, it's a possibility.
Well, absolutely. But there's a lot of decisions I have to make in the coming months.
All right. We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for coming in.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for joining us once again for the Ledge podcast. We'd love to hear from you. We're on all the social media channels, and you can reach us by email at mark@markwasiliumla.ca.